Well, it's pretty obvious, isn't it, given the last week or so and the fact that it's election year and the sort of debates we're having, that the issue of so-called climate change and the so-called climate crisis or climate emergency, if you're going to be completely doomer about it, is going to have a pretty big impact or be a pretty big talking point in this New Zealand election year. And interestingly, we have a new party playing, I guess, in that space, while the Greens have traditionally been perceived, whether in reality or not they are, as the party that would deal with climate change or the environment, though they've often, if you like, strayed into more socialist and, I guess, social justice issues. A new party's been formed called the Sustainable New Zealand Party. And it, of course, is hoping to, reach, 150,000 votes, break the 5% threshold, and be a player in Parliament. So how is Sustainable New Zealand any different than the Green Party? And where does it stand on the controversies that have raised their heads just in the last 7 days, 8 days in the New Zealand media? Well, to find out, we are joined now by the party's leader, Vernon Tava. Vernon, nice to talk to you again. Welcome to the program.
Hello, Sean. Thanks a lot for having me on.
All right, what state is the party in as we head into the election year? How many members you got?
Well, no party discloses their members.
Yes, they do. I did it when I worked for Top last time. They had 5,000 members.
I know Top did, but I thought that was foolish because you set up a
Well, you said no party did, and that wasn't true, Vernon. So how many members you got?
Well, that was the one that was naive enough to do it. You should go back and ask them how many they've got now, because I'll bet it was a lot less than that.
Okay, and I will be asking them than that when they're on next, Vernon. So you can't tell us how many members you've got, except it must be over 500 for you to be registered.
We're well clear of any necessary hurdles, and it's growing all the time. So I'm very comfortable where we're with there. We're in a good position. We launched in November last year. We've been registered as a party with the Electoral Commission, and we're very excited about the year to come. All right.
Have you showed up in the polls yet?
Well, there was only one that was very, very shortly after our registration, so early days yet. So no, in that single poll that there's been since, we haven't. But I'm confident we'll be registering over the next few months.
All right. Vernon, clearly the issues that you have painted yourselves as being interested in are going to be pertinent in this 2020 election.
Absolutely.
And you, I guess, would typify yourselves as an environmentally aware, conscious, and, if you like, activist party. How are you different from the Greens in your approach, or how are you going to be on the campaign trail?
Look, until now, with the Green Party, if you've wanted to vote for the environment, you've had to vote for a party that is well to the left of Labor and has functioned as something of a clearinghouse for New Zealand's left of Labor activist movements. If you take a look at the website's front page at the moment, you will see one post that is about the environment. The others are about the situation in Iraq, about what Goldrich thinks about Iran, about all sorts of other, various issues. And the focus on the environment seems to be exclusively, almost monomaniacally, on climate change, which, of course, is one of the many challenges we need to deal with and possibly one of the ones we can actually do the least about in New Zealand. So we're a lot more focused on not just those immediate environmental issues. We're not purely an environmental party. It's all there in the name. In Sustainable New Zealand, sustainability, of course, has its economic and social aspects as well. Ultimately, we're a party of pragmatic or practical environmentalists. We're pro-science. We're pro-business and green growth. We're pro-innovation. And a big difference between us and the Greens is that we actually have an optimistic vision of the future. We don't believe we're going to hell in a handbasket. We think that the challenges and the problems we face are actually things that we can deal with. And it's time for some adults in the room in the environmental debate who don't run around scaring the children and panicking everybody about how the world's going to end, but who actually say, listen, we've really got to sit down and work out a practical plan of how we're going to solve these problems and be optimistic about it. Give people some hope.
You know what, Vernon? I think that's a wonderful statement you've just made. What you've just told me is you're not doomers.
Absolutely not. We're anti-doomer.
Okay. So in that context, and I think you described that incredibly clearly for us, in that context, let's take a look at this issue that has kicked off in the last week, the issue of this teaching resource around climate change in schools, a teaching resource which has been widely condemned for encouraging people, or intermediate students to get worried about climate change and become activists and not really tolerate much suggestion that there is a differing view from the doomer view. What do you make of that resource?
I've had a good look at it because there was a lot of early comment, of course, made by people who hadn't actually read the thing. So I thought it's always a good point to have a look at it. Now, look, my first thought on this is I don't see why this couldn't be fit within science curriculum. Because it is a scientific issue we're dealing with. And all the solutions are scientific and engineering solutions. The bit I was particularly uncomfortable with in this resource was the section, I think it's chapter 7, about activism. What is an activist? What does an activist do? And so on. And look, to be frank, I'm not sure if it's entirely appropriate to be taught in schools, sort of activism studies. But more importantly, I think around the issue of climate change, actually the time for activism is largely past. I think the vast majority of people are aware of the issue we have to deal with. They are aware that, I know some people still maintain that, oh, look, maybe it doesn't really exist. But, I don't think that's a particularly viable position. That's not one I'm prepared to argue or engage in, really. The real point is this, though, is that we have a challenge to deal with that is primarily scientific, engineering and technologically based. And the time for raising awareness and freaking everybody out about it is past. We're seeing these marches in the streets. We're seeing outfits like Extinction Rebellion. Often when you ask people on these marches, well, what is it you actually want us to do? You generally get something like, well, we want you to declare a climate emergency or something like that. Now, my understanding of declaring an emergency, a state of emergency, is usually that comes with specific legislative and statutory powers that people have to actually do something about it. What we've actually seen with these declarations of emergency is a sort of a signifying, or symbolism around the issue, but not a lot of action to actually follow it. So I really do think the time for activism and whipping up a frenzy about this has passed, because what we're seeing now, and it particularly concerns me when this stuff is being pushed on young people, is we are hearing lots of reports from psychologists and psychiatrists who are saying that they've got large numbers of children and young people who are presenting with climate and eco-anxiety. They feel helpless, they feel guilt-ridden, they're panicked by the situation. They genuinely believe that they are not going to survive to see their adult years. And it really troubles me and actually makes me really angry to see guilt and anxiety being exploited for political gain.
All right. So what would you do if you were to get representation in a government after the election this year? What would you do with this teaching resource?
Well, I think we need to. I think we definitely need to take another look at it and the appropriateness of it. And as I said at the beginning, I do not see why this isn't just something that could be included in the science curriculum. Because, the atmospheric chemistry, this was stuff that was established early last century. This is a scientific issue, and that's the way to approach it in terms of understanding. And anything that goes beyond that and goes into advocating for a particular type of activism, I think is inappropriate.
Okay, so you would agree with Shane Jones that this is eco-Bible bashing to a certain extent?
I wouldn't use that term because that assumes that there's an attempt to sell something that's false, perhaps. But I do think that, we need to be, when we are actually advocating for particular forms of activism, and most particularly, and this is the real concern, is creating a sense of panic and anxiety. That doesn't actually help. That doesn't actually move us forward. So I feel like, people are really fighting the last war in that sense. They're insisting that we have to tell everybody how bad it is. We have to get everybody panicked and worked up. I really do think the time for that is past. It's time for us to actually be adults about this. It reminds me a bit of maybe going to, let's say you have a 5-year-old child and you're worried if you're going to be able to make your mortgage payment this month, and you go and tell them about it. How appropriate is that? Is that acting in an adult and responsible
fashion? Are you saying that the Green Party,
what we can change?
Do you believe the Green Party and the Labor Party are causing panic?
Oh, there's no question that we're seeing anxiety and panic being created around the way these things are being talked about. And it's not moving us forward. It's not actually, this is not working on practical solutions that are actually going to
and you saying that
to where we need to be.
Part of that problem is the Green Party and the Labor Party causing that concern and causing that anxiety?
Well, I think the Green Party in particular, for them, this is a central campaigning issue. They've obviously identified this as this is their point of difference. This is the thing where they're making their political running, and they're perfectly happy to maximise fear and concern around this issue. And what we're saying is, listen, we've got to get past that. It's actually not helping. It's actually paralysing people. It's actually causing something of a mental health crisis in some quarters. And what we really need to do is just sit down and start calmly planning what we're going to do about this.
All right. Do you believe or do you support the suggestion and the resource that people should eat less meat? And goodness, we've heard a lot in the last few days about what a silly idea that is.
Well, look, let me tell you personally, I'm vegan, okay? So I don't eat meat, I don't eat dairy. That's my personal choice. Would I be comfortable in this being taught in schools, particularly without any actual scientific or nutritional attribution in the materials? Actually, no. I think if a young person, someone who's of intermediate age, isn't supported by their parents in doing that, kids of that age generally aren't cooking their own dinner and making their own lunch and breakfast, right? So I went vegetarian when I was young. I was about 12 or 13 and just stopped eating meat. But I didn't have a nutritionally balanced diet, and I felt weak and unhealthy, and it didn't work out because this is something that is a decision that should be made by a child or a young person with their parents, and they need to be supported in that. Just telling them to do that at schools and having kids just going, oh well, I'm just going to stop eating meat, may not necessarily be the best outcome. But if people reach that decision themselves, and this is what I've always said about veganism, vegetarianism, whatever, this is a decision I've made myself. I've made my own choice. But should the government or the education system be telling people to do it? No, I don't think they should.
Right. Vernon, climate refugees is an issue we are looking at today, and whilst the UN has supported us in rejecting a guy from Kiribati who had a few other problems like 2 wives amongst his issues. He said he was the first climate refugee from Kiribati. The UN has kind of issued an edict saying you cannot send climate refugees back home. I really wonder what a climate refugee is and whether or not it's going to be the great, terrible consequence that everyone says it is. Where is your party on climate refugees?
Well, I'll tell you one thing, is I think we might see politicians being a little more moderate in what they are attributing to climate change and what they aren't, because we're going to start seeing some very, very real consequences. These kinds of provisions in international law are pretty powerful. It's the reason Carol Trubeck is still in the country. It's that same type of provision of saying this person is in imminent danger of radically diminished quality of life or physical threat or even harm or death as a result of, in this case, climate change. So these things do actually make a difference in individual decisions. This could potentially open us up to having to accept people from, well, basically the entire Pacific, and not being able to send back even people who have committed crimes. Because there is this idea that if we send them back, there will be they'll have to suffer the impact of climate change. And I think what we will see, first of all, this advice from the UN, it's not binding, and a country always has the right to assess how exactly and to what extent they will balance that against other considerations with immigration. But it's a thing that I think we'll see a lot more precision and concern around what's being attributed to climate change and what isn't.
Vernon, I thank you very much indeed for your time today. Can I tell you by the text we're getting in, quite a positive reaction amongst our audience and our listeners to the way you have conducted yourself today, and no doubt we will talk a little more this year. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sean.
Cheers.